Good morning and welcome to the third meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee. Can I please ask everyone to ensure their mobile phones are in silent? And just a reminder that broadcasting will operate your camera and microphone as usual. Please allow a short pause before being called on to speak to allow them to do so. Agenda item 1 today, we have consideration of whether to take agenda item 4 in private. Item 4 is consideration of the evidence heard today on the Travelling Fun Fares Licence in Scotland Bill. As we're meeting remotely, rather than asking whether everyone agrees, I will, as usual, instead ask if anyone objects. If there's silence, I will assume you're content. Does anyone object? Okay, thank you very much. That is agreed, and item 4 will be taken in private. Agenda item 2, the committee will take evidence on the Travelling Fun Fares Licence in Scotland Bill. This is the first of 2 evidence sessions of bills, after a call for views that attracted a good response from stakeholders and the public. Today we hear from the local government sector and from representatives of the travelling fun fare trade. I also welcome Richard Lyle, who introduced this bill. He will have an opportunity to ask questions to both panels once committee members have finished with theirs. And I'd like to now welcome our first panel, which is Alec James Colquhoun, Chairman of the Scottish section of the Showman's Guild, Andrew Masterton, a Scottish showman, and Fiona Stewart, Senior Solicitor, Society of Local Authority Lawyers and Administrators in Scotland, known as SOLAR. Thank you for all being here today and for your written submissions. For information, we've allocated an hour for this session and we have a number of issues to discuss with you. With some brief technical information before we get started. There's a pre-arranged questioning order and I will call each member in turn to ask their questions for a block of up to 8 minutes. It would help broadcasting if members could indicate who in the panel their questions are addressed to. And if we do this, we may have a short amount of time for supplementary questions at the end. As there are 3 people in the panel, please indicate clearly if you wish to answer the question, for instance by raising your hand. And don't feel the need to answer a question if your views are generally in line with points already made. Please could everyone give broadcasting staff a second to operate your microphones before you speak. And we will now move on to questions, and I will begin. Can I ask, what's the main reason for this bill being introduced in the first place? What difference would this bill make, say, for example, to the showman? I wonder if I could get a response from one of the show people here, please. Mr. Colquhoun.
Thank you, Mr. Convener. This would make a huge difference to showmen. We are the only country in Europe that has public entertainment licensing. They don't have it in England, Wales, Northern Ireland. This is the only country that implements this sort of licensing regime. If all of the local authorities, and not every local authority, should I say, is difficult with this. Many local authorities have a fair and standard system, but many go above and beyond what we feel is restrictive to our business. It's restrictive to our members. In many cases, we also feel it's discriminatory. Our members, ideally, would rather be the same as the rest of the United Kingdom and Europe and have no licensing system whatsoever. No difference between a fun fair that operates in Scotland and a fun fair that operates in England, in Wales or in Northern Ireland. But we understand that because licensing has been here for a long time, it came in by a mistake. It was missed by our parliamentary agents. They didn't know that they were working for Scotland, so it came in, it became law, and it took a long time for all local authorities to take it up. But we have 32 local authorities doing 32 different things. It's totally unreasonable. I have some evidence that hopefully I'll be allowed to put in later that shows the extreme differences in charges and in conditions and things that have to do with public entertainment licensing. And it has to be noted that this is only for our public entertainment licence that allows us to operate. We also, before you can apply for your entertainment licence, you have to go along, negotiate with the local authority, which 90% of fairs are held on, and negotiate to get the land. You will have to pay the rental, you have to pay reinstatement for parks and all these other things, you have to put advertisement in. You have to do all of that before you can even apply for your licence. So, there's many aspects to this. That in itself, the Public Services Act says that you should only have to negotiate with a local authority on one occasion for the one service. We don't do that. We have to do it twice. So there's all these aspects to it, and it's been restricting the business.
Okay, thanks for that. Mr. Masterton, you have had first-hand experience of not being able to go ahead with events because of licensing requirements. Could you maybe give us a practical example of this?
A practical example would be in September 2019. We had applied for a public entertainment licence from Perth and Kinross Council, paid the application fee. It was in the region of £320, £325. And nearer the time, it was a private piece of land, it wasn't owned by the council. Nearer the time, the heavens opened and the field became waterlogged. I had applied for a set period of time, set dates that my fair would run to and from. Nearer the time, showmen became apprehensive about taking large vehicles, vans, lorries onto a grass site, and the landowner was also apprehensive about allowing the event to go ahead. We did the right thing. We cancelled the event. It didn't go ahead. I took the £325 hit. I didn't get my money back. The event didn't go on. We did the right thing. There was no damage, and hopefully we can use the site again in the future. But because of the restrictive nature of public entertainment licences, there wasn't the opportunity to either vary the site and move to a hard standing site. The same owner has a large car park outside a hotel. We could have moved across the road, or we could have varied the dates. I lost my money. All the showmen that were going to attend that event lost a week's business. I think that's a very, very real example of this act preventing or making it difficult for showmen to operate. It certainly cost me a lot of money.
Can I ask then, what would be the difference, excuse me, what would be the difference between that circumstance for you and local events where local activists and local businesses have put a lot of effort into making sure that everything goes on this Saturday? The heavens are open, this happens certainly where I come from in Glasgow on a regular basis, and the thing is cancelled. Why should it be different for show people than it should be for other people who want to run events?
I can't speak for everybody. For all other events, it's, from our point of view, this is what we do to earn a living. An event may be run by a voluntary group who aren't looking to put food on the table at the end of the week, at the end of the event. We don't earn money if the event doesn't go ahead. And the nature and the conditions of the public entertainment licence say you're either open or you're closed. You're either earning money or you're not. I'll try and keep my answer short. Other events, maybe organised by volunteers, are peripheral. They have another source of income. This is what we do to earn money.
Okay. All right. I'm going to pass on to Sarah Boy, Vice Convener. Thank you. I may come back.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning to all the witnesses. Very much looking forward to following up the evidence that you've submitted in advance. Can I just follow up with Mr. Colquhoun? Your first comment, you made a comment that this legislation applies in Scotland as a result of a mistake. Can you give us a bit more detail on that comment and say why it was a mistake?
Yes, when the Act was going through the UK Parliament at the time in 1982 and the Act was coming in, we had parliamentary agents that were working for the Showmen's Guild of Great Britain. Those parliamentary agents weren't aware that they were working for Scotland. So because this legislation was simply for Scotland, they don't have this same Act in England, fun fairs are exempt from it, they didn't pick up on it, and it wasn't reported to the Showmen's Guild. So it kind of came in through the back door. And at the beginning, as you know, not all local authorities have to take this up. It's taken many years. It took around 10 years for every local authority to take it up. Some local authorities, there's no charge. Murray Council have no charge for a public entertainment licence. In Edinburgh, it can be above £6,000. So it came in at first. It wasn't picked up by the parliamentary agents. It then obviously became law. and it started to be implemented, it would be £15. You know, at the very beginning, £15 for a public entertainment licence. Very simple process. Over time, all local authorities have taken this on. Many of them, we feel, and at 3 occasions we've had to get Richard Lyle to ask questions in the Parliament to clarify the regulations that are in this, on health and safety issues, on issues with double licensing. We already hold a public entertainment licence, but then some local authorities ask you to have a licence for a snack bar. You know, all of these kind of things we try to get clarification on, and we've worked really hard with the local authorities. We don't want to bite the hand that feeds us. 90% of fun fairs are held on local authority land. We want to work with the local authorities, but we're coming to a point where it's becoming unworkable. There are areas in Scotland that is no go for fun fairs. Young people coming into this business or starting out can't get ahead. They can't get a chance to operate. Not many people would risk what Andrew Masterton has done there and put money on the line with a chance of losing that money for a fair. You know, and that's £300 odd is probably one of the more reasonable licence fees. It's so difficult to get a step on the ladder, and this is holding everyone back.
So can you tell me from your perspective, how do local authorities in other parts of the UK deal with issues like potential noise issues, litter, emergency planning, things that you would, regardless of what your views are and how much you should pay for a licence or not, how are those things actually controlled in a way that's publicly visible to everybody?
Yeah, well, the Scottish Showman's Guild, strangely enough, goes over into England. We covered Carlisle, Wigton. So we put on an Easter fair in Carlisle. We have, in England, they'll term it a licence to occupy. In Scotland, that would be your lease. In Scotland, you would go, you'd arrange your lease, you get your conditions and your terms. In England, it's to occupy. And that is very much the same as what your licence application is for a public entertainment licence. But it doesn't carry any extra charge. I have a note here from Leeds, the Yorkshire section of the Showman's Guild, where for larger fairs, they impose a £50 administrative fee to do extra things, only if it's a large fair. You apply very much on a licence, but it's a licence to occupy. So that covers your rental. And the rental of the fair, you have all your conditions. You know, you can see it's quite a document there. It refers to your paperwork. You have to give exactly what's on site, your toilets, all of the things that you do in a public entertainment licence are covered by your licence to occupy, which is, in Scotland, would be your lease. And as I say, you have to negotiate that lease prior to going and applying for your public entertainment licence. So you're dealing with the local authorities on 2 occasions. I've seen some of the things saying, why should it only be 21 days? It's not only 21 days, it's 21 days for your licence application. You could be 2 or 3 months in advance negotiating with the local authority parks department or the, you know, whatever department covers the area that you want to occupy to get your lease. You know, negotiate, because there'll be reinstatement fees. Obviously, there's a rental. All of these things are negotiated first. Then when you get that lease to occupy the site, you then go and have to put that in to cover your public entertainment licence, to show you have the land first and foremost. Laws are the same across the UK. The health and safety law is the same. You know, for any noise, things like that, the laws are already in place. If there's any issues on them things, they're all dealt with. We had 2 years ago at Carlisle, there was a lady in a house not far away who was getting a lot of noise. She contacted the council come down. We discovered that it was one of the speakers for one of the rides. The way it was facing, it was kind of bouncing back and making it too loud. That was moved. The issue was dealt with. Things like this will come up and we can deal with it. But everything is there in place already. It's all there. Without public entertainment licence, all these things are in place for the councils to deal with all these issues.
Can you give me a quick answer to a question I'm going to ask? Because I'd like to get on to ask a similar question to Fiona Stewart from Solar. Can you just say to me, did you say there that 80% of the sites in Scotland that your members use are actually owned by councils?
Yeah.
Or was it public sector in general?
No, most fairs will be on local authority land. Most fun fairs will take place on public parks, on council run land. Most of the fairs that we deal with are all dealt with through local authorities. You will have some, and as things move forward and sites become difficult to get, some retail parks and things like that. But when you deal with the retail parks, they're already used to dealing with fairs and things in England. They will straight away, because they, their property, they deal with these things. They will ask for all your paperwork, your insurances, everything will be lodged with them out with the licence. But most of our fairs are held on council-run land.
Okay, that's very helpful, thanks. Can I ask Fiona Stewart from Solar to come in my next question, which is just to give a perspective from the local authority side about how the system works in Scotland, very different from the rest of the UK. And one of your comments was that you thought that the 1982 Act should be reviewed. Is that something you've discussed with the Scottish Government, and why do you think it should be reviewed? Is it you think the legislation is inappropriate or doesn't work as well as it might do? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it is something that we have discussed with the Scottish Government over a number of years. We have a representative from the licensing division of the Scottish Government at every meeting that we host. The 1982 Act is now almost 40 years old. The circumstances that occurred when it was implemented, life has moved on. It no longer reflects how modern day life and events and activities take place. It does not reflect the electronic age, for example, and we feel that the whole Act needs an overhaul in terms of licensing, so that all licenses are updated, revised and brought into the modern age, and processes are streamlined, but at the same time maintaining the public safety reasons that the Act was brought in. Our perspective is that fairgrounds on the whole operate well. They're welcome in our areas. They are subject to the same safety requirements that all licensed activities licensed under the Act are, subject to the same grounds of refusal. There are 4 grounds of refusal, and we work to the best of our ability to make the existing legislation work. But it is outdated, it is antiquated, but we do not see why fairgrounds should be singled out when the Act itself needs to be looked at, so that every licence type is treated in the same way, fairly, brought up to date and their needs met.
Convener, can you indulge me? Am I allowed to ask a supplementary to Fiona Stewart? And
short question.
Just that issue, thank you, James, about ownership that was raised by Alec Colquhoun. Do you have a similar view about so many proposals are on local government sites, and that means that there's already a scrutiny, or do you have a different view on that issue about the actual rental of the sites as well as the licensing?
I can only speak for my own council there, because it's the only one I have detailed knowledge of, and certainly we are trying to work closer with our landscape services for the council-owned land sites, but my initial investigations have discovered that the landscape services site only look at the lease of the land. They don't have detailed operating conditions for the fair. They are left to the licence, but we do have a one Aberdeenshire policy that we are looking to streamline, so that applicants only have one point of contact, but separate services behind the scenes may still deal with the one activity. We also have a number of fairs that take place on private land in Aberdeenshire, so that makes it more complicated for us. We have viewers managers that own private sections of land that fairs operate on. So it is slightly more complicated because we are not in control of the lease of that land. So the licence becomes important then.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Alexander? Before I bring in Alexander, I should have mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, Annie Wells gave her apologies today. So just to put that on the record, and then now can I ask Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Mr. Colquhoun, you've already explained in your written evidence and in questioning this morning that the flexibility to meet local circumstances is a key feature in the Licensing Act here, but that does disadvantage fairground operators, and it may well be advantaging the local authorities. And that's the basic problem you have, or the basic reasons behind some of the concerns you've raised. So can I ask you to go into more detail on that, and then if Fiona can then look upon it as with reference to the local authorities?
Where to begin? Firstly, if we begin on fees, I have some evidence here that was put in by Taylors of Edinburgh. They're a funfair company that work out of Edinburgh. They gave me two receipts here for fairs that they put on, one at Falkirk Stadium and one at Grangemouth for the Gala Day, which are both 2-week fairs. So that their prices are £263 for the licence for each of those fairs. That's Falkirk District Council. They then go on, they have a fair on the Links at Musselburgh. That licence application comes in at £190 for the licence application for that fair, the exact same fair that took place. We then move into Edinburgh, which is very important to them. They're known as Taylors of Edinburgh. That's their hometown, that's where they come from. They put two fairs on in Edinburgh. The first one is on Leith Links. The licence application fee is £4,464 for a 5-day fair in Edinburgh. That's out with advertisement, security, all of the other things that come along. Then they move on to the Meadows in Edinburgh. The licence application for Edinburgh is £6,332 for a 5-day fair. Edinburgh is basically a no-go area for fun fairs. These are the differences. Now, as I say, Moray Council, they are licences free there. Dumfries and Galloway have a condition in there. If it's only 5 riding devices, again, it's free. This allows the small towns and villages to still have their fun fairs at the Gala Days, just small fairs. This is what licensing is doing. It's stopping fairs taking place in the small towns and villages. So it's taking that part away from them. You can only afford to take a chance on a licence fee because there's no chance if your licence is refused or you don't get to go ahead with the fair, the money is lost. So it's causing these troubles.
And that in itself is a major disadvantage to you as entrepreneurs, business people who are trying to make a living on your organisations and structure, and you are prohibited or you have to take a huge impasse before you even start to make 1 penny back.
That's exactly right. And some local authorities are very good. Aberdeenshire, I think, is £153 for the licence application. So they're relatively good. Fife has more fun fairs than anywhere else in Scotland because their system is very good. Up until recently, if you applied to the local authority in Fife for a fun fair, they didn't require you to then have a public entertainment licence because it was already dealt with. They've since changed that policy and now you have to have both. But these are the types of things. But then you move on to objections and other things. In West Lothian, a number of years ago, I think it was 2013, someone within the council and came up with an idea of fencing off all of the fun fairs, all of the gala days. There was 5 gala days that were going to be affected, needed to be fenced off. The local authority said it was the police. The police said it was a local authority that wanted to impose this. I, as the chairman of the guild at the time, took the decision because there's also, when you have a licence hearing, many of our members aren't comfortable going to this licence hearing. They have to employ a lawyer. We took the lawyer to that licence hearing. We got a letter from Melvin Sandel he was the head of Health and Safety at the time. Health and Safety Executive is the body responsible for relating health and safety on fairgrounds across the UK. It has no similar licensing scheme and will not seek one. It is not consulted in any way on a local authority licence for a fairground and is not asked to see any information on the licence. We also added to that there was no stipulation on fencing off a fairground. Many of our members couldn't have gone ahead with the fair because they were on common land. It was on public parks. They couldn't fence off that fair because it was breaking their conditions of let that they'd already agreed with the same local authority that was trying to object to that licence. The lawyer's bill came to just over £2,000. He won each of those cases, so it was a win. But the Showman's Guild picked up that bill for the members because that £2,000 bill, couldn't be absorbed by the members that were attending those fairs. But that was 5 gala days within West Lothian that were having this issue. Myself and Richard actually went to see them to try and sort this out. The local authority was blaming the police. They never had any. These are the types of things that we're getting. We have many local authorities open it up for temporary licences to objections from local people that live. We find there are many cases of discrimination. In one case, a fair in Carluke, teacher objected using the words that you do not know who's living in those caravans when children are walking past. On the same application, you won't be able to walk our dogs in the park because show people are well known for stealing dogs. Imagine how our members would feel. That licence application was granted, even with those objections. But the member decided not to take the fair. Again, he paid the lawyer's fee, he paid his licence fee. He decided not to go to that fair because the feelings were so strong. That, this is causing our members to feel discriminated against in some cases, and local authorities are allowing this. It's really difficult.
Thank you. So Fiona Stewart, can I ask you that the onus is on local authorities? There seems to be an advantage here. Some seem to be milking the system and using it as a stream of income so they can advantage themselves against these individuals who are trying to run a business.
Thank you for your question. The Act is clear that the licence fee should be set at a level that covers the local authority's costs of processing the application. It's actually an application fee rather than a licence fee, so it's to cover what our administration costs are. There are no national criteria set down in the Act for what councils should take into account. So each council has to work out its own costs. We certainly in Aberdeenshire review our fees every 5 years. We do quite a detailed investigation costings, and we do a light touch review at 2 yearly intervals, and the fees are upgraded by inflation every 1st of April. So for a long time our fee was £50. We discovered that that did not cover our costs, went up to £90. When we last did our in-depth fee review in 2017, it worked out that it costs just under £150 to process an issue a fairground licence. So we put the fee up to £151, and with inflation it's now £153. I can't speak for the authorities that charge much higher fees or much lesser fees than that, but as part of my call as SOLAR chair that the legislation needs to be reviewed to provide some consistency in fees. Certainly in Aberdeenshire the fee covers our costs. With regard to objections in licensing hearings, as I mentioned earlier, there are statutory grounds of refusal. If a temporary licence is issued, it's not advertised, but that does not mean that members of the public and outside bodies cannot object. If there's an objection or representation, we must hold a hearing because we have to provide natural justice, a fair right to be heard both to the applicant and to the objectors. It's the same process for fairgrounds as it is for any other licence type under the Civic Government Act, and under human rights legislation we are bound to comply with that. Now, I'm not saying I can't comment on the discrimination issues that have been raised, but a licence can only be refused if there is evidence to suggest that a ground of refusal applies. SOLAR does agree that an appeals process is necessary, and we would welcome an appeals process for temporary licences to further that natural justice issue. Certainly no local authority should be making a profit. We should be covering the costs of processing the application and producing the licence. So no local authority should be making a profit, but we have raised this with the Scottish Government ourselves, that we need a steer of what criteria we should be taking into account, what we should be disregarding, so that there is more uniformity across the country in relation to not just fairground licence fees, but all civic government licence fees.
Thank you, but it is quite obvious that some local authorities are making profit out of this. So thank you, Convener. I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Yeah, but I think that's a bit of a statement to make, Alexander, that the local authorities are breaking the rules of the legislation. So we need evidence to put that in the record. Okay, can I ask Keith Brown to come in, please?
Thanks, Convener. First of all, to Mr Colquhoun, my main question is really about the fees, as we've been discussing, but can I just clarify one point? First of all, you said the legislation, when it came through in '82, was through the back door, because the agents acting for the Showman's Guild hadn't noticed it applied to Scotland. I don't think that equates to being the back door. That's nothing to do with the government at the time. And believe you me, I'm not rushing to defend the government of 1982, but just to clarify, is that right? It was the agents that missed it rather than the government trying to sneak it through.
It was the parliamentary. It was our mistake. Our parliamentary agents that we employed wasn't aware that they were working for Scotland. So when there were parts of legislation that were being put through at that time, they totally missed that because it was solely the Civic Government Scotland Act. So they missed it. It was never flagged up to the Scottish Showman's Guild until it became law. And as I say, it took a couple of years for some. I think Glasgow was the first one, and it was £15 at the very beginning. They were the first ones to take it up, and it took many years until all of the local authorities actually took on board to carry out a public entertainment licence. Maybe the back door wasn't the right way to describe it, but it was missed.
Thanks for it. Just on the fee. Yeah, it's caused problems ever since, I understand that. Just on the fees, I'm just trying to clarify, given the discussion we just had, is it the Showman's Guild view that it does seem extraordinary that some authorities like Edinburgh can charge thousands, including hundreds of pounds for each device that's inspected and so on, and yet others charge nothing at all? So my question really is it the Showman's Guild's view that local authorities should be entitled to recover the costs that are incurred in allowing these licences or processing these licences? Or is it your view that the licensing process, at least in this respect, is covered by other things and doesn't really have to be undertaken at all, thereby taking away the issue of the fees in the first place? Just what would be the view of the Showman's Guild in relation to that?
My members would want me to sit here and say they would like to be like England, have the same process as England, Wales. We have English showmen come here, Scottish showmen travel to England, we travel the full of the UK. They would like the same system put in place. As the chairman of the Showman's Guild, I'm working on this for a long time to even get to this point here, trying to work with COSLA and other local authorities to try and sort these things out. I realise that this has been here since 1982. It's going to be very difficult to change it. So we're happy that some system needs to stay in place. We can't just wipe the system away. We have had discussions on this and many different things. We're trying to come up with a balance of doing it. As I say, some local authorities now, the £50 charge that's suggested here would be more money than what's in place at the moment. It's so difficult to come up with a balance. We've been trying for a very, very long time, sit down and get to a point, just to sort these things out, to make it easier, to make the system the same across the 32 local authorities. When the Better Regulation Bill was being discussed a number of years ago, we thought that was the very thing for us, because it was looking at making things across all of the 32 local authorities, standardising it so everything, each form, it would be the same form, it would be the same cost, it would be the same process. The regulation changed and the ideas at the beginning changed, and unfortunately that didn't happen. We've had to come to the Scottish Parliament a number of times to try and get guidance. We've had to go to Police Scotland to try and get guidance. Sometimes the local authorities just won't take that on board. Myself and Richard Lyle have sat in council offices trying to explain, put Police Scotland's point across, put the Scottish Parliament's point across, and the licensing authority lawyer has just said that's not the way I interpret it. And because there is a part in the Act that says local authorities may impose conditions they see fit, they feel they can impose anything. I disagree with that strongly, and so do many others. Many times we've been suggested that we take things further to judicial review and things like that, but we don't want to bite the hand that feeds us, because the local authorities are the ones that give us the land to operate on. We can't make enemies of them. We don't want to cause trouble. We want to just get on and do the business that we've been doing for generations. That's simply what we want to do.
Thanks very much. I have to say I missed the first probably 2/3 of that answer. My screen froze, but I can pick that up by going back to the records. My next question really was for Fiona Stewart, and it's similar really. How can it be the case that the principle, which I understand, that local authorities should be able to recover the costs in processing an application or a licence, can vary so greatly across local authorities to thousands in some cases, nothing at all in other cases? And also, I used to be a clerk to the Civic Government Committee in a local authority, and I sat in a local authority, and I'm conscious that there are quite a number of different licensing applications and processes under the Civic Government Scotland Act. Is the situation in relation to show people applying for public entertainment licences comparable to other ones?
In terms of the level set?
That's for yours.
In terms of the level set, do you mean?
Well, just really the process is followed and
yes, the process.
No, I mean really in terms of the process that's set. So I know this.
Yeah, the process set is very similar for all licence types. Obviously, the fun fares don't have the vehicle testing that taxis do, for example. You have to remember as well that fun fares are not the only public entertainment licence that local authorities issue. Some local authorities will differentiate fees depending on the type of event or activity that a public entertainment licence has. Some local authorities will set a set fee for all public entertainment licences that they issue. I'm not saying that's an excuse or a reason for setting higher fees, but again, authorities have not got any national criteria to set like for like. Certainly in Aberdeenshire, the fun fair licence is a lot lower than, say, a Highland show or an agricultural show. We do have graded fees. We do also have fees for charitable organisations that are slightly lower than they would for commercial operations. That's the way that Aberdeenshire has interpreted how it covers its fees. Obviously, other local authorities have interpreted it differently, but we are in agreement that fees is something that needs to be looked at for all licence types under the Civic Government Act, not just the fun fares. With regards to processing, the Schedule 1 of the 1982 Act sets out very clearly the factors that local authorities should be taking into account. We have to consult with the police and the fire master, but most local authorities will also take into account planning, environmental health, building standards. Certainly for Aberdeenshire, we do liaise with the Health and Safety Executive for fun fares. They receive copies of all of our applications and copies of the licences that are issued because they have an enforcement role to play. On occasion, and I'm talking going back 15 to 18 years now, they have stepped in and advised us not to issue licences for safety reasons, but they tend to be a silent partner. So it's how it's interpreted that the licence needs to be processed, administered, and the cost of that. So there is variation. We are very much aware that there's variation, but we need some kind of national criteria to be able to assist us in addressing that. But the only thing I can think of for higher fees is that there's a set fee for all public entertainment licences, and that local authority has not chosen to categorise for different types of activity that can be licensed using that licence. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah. If I can just get one follow-up, convener, just on that point. I've got time, convener. Or?
Yeah, on you go.
Yeah, just to say that this committee often hears local authorities saying they want to have discretion, quite rightly, and then we hear we have to do this because we don't have national guidance. Surely it's up to the local authorities. They could just do the right thing. If they think these charges are punitive in some cases, they could just say we're not going to do that. You don't really have to get the Scottish Government to tell you this is what the guidance is, do you?
Well, we're not comparing like with like then, so you can't compare the fees across Scotland if we're not all setting fees to the same criteria. We can certainly, as legal clerks, discuss it at SOLAR and take it back to our individual councils, but it's our councils that set the fees. The councillors at the end of the day have the power to set those fees over and above what we say, and without a national steer of, say, you have to take X amount of officers' time, you have to take account of the fees paid elsewhere, unless we're all comparing like with like, and there is a national steer of the types of things that authorities should be taking into account, you'll get wide differences because local authorities are making their best attempt at doing what they think is correct, and that's how this wide discrepancy has come about. I acknowledge that fees way back in 1985, when most PEL systems came in, would have been a lot lower, but costs have increased and the way of processing these have increased, and we do have to cover our costs, and fairgrounds are no different in terms of any other applicant in that regard when it comes to having a licence processed. It's not what you want to hear. Well, I can certainly take it back to SOLAR and discuss it there, but ultimately it's in the hands of our councillors.
Okay, thanks for that. Before I bring Andy in, can I just ask Fiona, you said there that sometimes you'll charge different fees depending on what sort of event it is, but I thought that the whole purpose of these fees was just to cover your costs. How do the two of those things marry?
The two of those things marry. For example, a large music event can take a lot longer to process. It involves a lot of time sitting around a table with multiple organisations, looking at the safety of events, working on event safety plans, tweaking it. It can mean going to committees. So the cost of producing a licence for that type of event can be a lot higher than it does for a funfair event that rarely requires a hearing, is usually done by letter responses or email responses and can be turned around much quicker. So our administrative costs in organising that, there's less involvement, less interaction with the applicant to ensure the event is safe, therefore we can issue a licence cheaper.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Bringing in Andy here, but can I ask that the responses are a bit quicker than they have been to date, please, because we've still got a fair bit to go and we've only got till 10 o'clock for this, well, just after 10 o'clock for this session. So, Andy Whiteman, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. First, if I could just ask a brief question to Alex Colquhoun. You said that around about 80% of fairs are held on public land. Can you confirm that a great majority of that public land is common land that's been held by towns for centuries, in which your members and predecessors have been operating fairs on for centuries?
Yes, most cases it'll be public parks. It's common land that's sited in the centre of the town or in and around that area. That's traditionally where we would attend. We have lots of fairs that are royal charter fairs that date back hundreds of years. These are all based on that system. That's where we want to operate. We have lost as many fairs that have been lost because of issues with common land. Dumbarton Common, there was 2 fairs a year on there. That was lost through licensing issues, and those 2 fairs have gone. Most of these events will take place. I mean, this is another difference in England than there is in Scotland. In England, they have the Fairs and Markets Act, where local towns and authorities have to have common land that is available to have market, to have fairs. That's why there's many more fairs in England. We don't have that again in Scotland. We have this public entertainment licence that works against us on it. But most occasions and most times, and anyone that goes out looking for a site for a fun fair will begin with the local authority, looking at the parks, the football pitches, all that kind of common land that's available. That's where our members would begin.
Okay, thank you. And Fiona Stewart, you said in an earlier question when you were talking about the need to review the Civic Government Scotland Act, you said, why should fairs be singled out? I presume that's in reference to the bill that's before us. Could I put to you that presumably the reason that fairs have been singled out is because fair operators have identified an issue they've got, that this is not a regime that operates in England and Wales, because they travel around the country and therefore are often operating in different local authorities, because they are full-time businesses, and because there's no flexibility built into the system to enable them to move just across the road, as it were. Do you not accept that those are the kinds of arguments that merit, regardless of your views on the detail of the bill, that merit fair operators having a new statutory regime?
No, because we equally have markets that come in from the continent, travel around the country. We have street traders, burger vans, people that sell goods that travel around the country, they equally have to apply for licences in each local authority area. They're commercial, they're subject to the same requirements. If the weather's bad or a pitch is bad, a market can't move from one location to another without requiring another licence. Neither can a street trader. Other types of events licensed under public entertainment, if the weather is bad or there's a reason they can't go ahead, they've got to absorb the loss as well. I appreciate some of them are voluntary organisations, but they have to take the hit of the cost as well. As the commercial operators. So if these other operators have to take the hit, then why should the rules be different from fairgrounds? Because these businesses equally are travelling around the country. So you're creating a two-tier system where other businesses that travel will be subject to civic government rules and fairgrounds will be subject to the fairground rules. We should be able to work a solution by looking at the Civic Government Act as a whole and bringing that up to modern day standards that will balance the needs of the operators against the needs of the local authority to issue those licences. So they're not the only ones that face these difficulties.
Okay. There's no provisions in this bill for any consultation with communities over the application for a licence. Could I maybe, because I have you there, Fiona, start with you and then move on to Mr Masterton and Mr Colquhoun? Do you have a view?
Yeah, this is very concerning to us because communities should be given a voice. These businesses, not just fairgrounds, but all licensed activities are taking place within their communities. We frequently get complaints from neighbours, which we can only deal with after the fact, excuse me. So why shouldn't communities be given a voice? Because these have an impact. We welcome the fairs. 9 times out of 10 there are no problems, but police and fire alone is not sufficient. Councillors know their areas. They're the ones that get the complaints from the public, and we have to deal with that in some way. Otherwise it hits the front page of local press. We want to be fair, but we need to give the communities a voice as well.
I go to Mr Masterton next, please.
Am I on?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Yes, I welcome people, local communities being given the opportunity to make representation. In my experience, I can only speak as a showman operating in my own right. I've sat in licensing committees unsure whether my business is going to go ahead at the weekend. Based on representations, we've been called in front of the licensing committee. More often than not, representations, they're based on a premise of supposition, they're based on hearsay, they're based on speculation. I'm quite happy to go to a licensing committee and be held to account for my track record, having operated on that site previously. Sometimes representations can be made without consequence. Sometimes people that make representations don't need to account for their position. Sometimes representations are just based on NIMBYism or just pure prejudice against showmen, against us being perceived as travellers. This Act gives provision for the police to make representation. I think that's perfectly good and valid. If we've been on a site before, police can assess my suitability as an applicant based on any criminal record check. The local authority can base an opinion on the suitability of my rides, whether they have ride safety certificates, whether I have public liability insurance. Sometimes people can make representations to stop us based on NIMBYism, not in my backyard, or just pure prejudice. And I would like to see the police being the funnel through which representations are made.
Okay, thank you. Mr Colquhoun, do you have any comments on this matter?
I mean, I'm going to read from, this is the Scottish Government's guidance on temporary licences. Now, temporary licences are available up to 6 weeks to local authorities. Where an application for a temporary licence has been submitted, the licensing authority need only consult the Chief Constable and, if necessary, the Fire Authority. That's in the Act just now. That's in the schedule. That's in the Temporary Licence Act. It's very similar to this. I do understand that there will be issues, but as Andrew said there, sometimes people will object just to try and stop them until we even get the fair to go ahead. If sites are unsuitable, we fully understand that. There have been sites that have been lost that we wouldn't argue with because that site has been unsuitable for various reasons. That does happen, and it will happen. But we are being stopped from operating without even being given the opportunity, as Andrew has said. Now, local people can object. If they're objecting, they will object through the local council. That can be dealt with at least part of the point. If that park isn't suitable, it can be dealt with the local authority when we are applying for the lease without going to a licence hearing, without paying all of the money and going through hearing. That can be dealt with if people are concerned, but at least give us the opportunity to try, put that fair on and try to work with it. There are laws there. If the music is too loud, the environmental health from the council can come down and we can deal with these things. We've had that in the past. I remember one instance in Fife where a fairground pulled on the site at 7 o'clock at night because it was tight getting in the thing, so they waited till the cars and the traffic was down, pulled on that site. They didn't even set up. The next morning, at 8 o'clock in the morning, there were police there. There'd been objections from the noise, from the music, from the fair. The fair hadn't even set up yet, and there were people objecting to the noise from the fair. These are the issues that we face. In some cases, people just do not want that fun fair there. We've had instances in Glasgow where new flats have been built around public parks and in other areas. Buildings have been turned into flats and one of the things. They believe that is their front garden and they do not want a fun fair operating there. Even if it may have been in Glasgow, the Glasgow Fair, which the Glasgow Fair holidays are named after, doesn't happen anymore. That's a royal chartered fair that doesn't happen because flats and things were built around the park. The fair was moved into the park where it's way over the back, where no one can see it, where the public don't really want to walk in. The ladies who used to go and play their bingo, used to be 4 or 5 bingos there. Old ladies used to come. They don't want to walk away into the back of that park. That fair is now gone.
Can you keep your answer a bit shorter, Mr. Colquhoun, please?
Sorry. Yeah, I'll finish there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Fiona, you wanted to come in. Fiona Stewart, you wanted to come in at that point?
Yeah, I'll keep it very brief.
Yes, please.
The temporary licence section does not prevent a local authority from consulting other bodies in relation to producing a licence. It doesn't say we must only liaise with the police and the fire. We've got to be satisfied that the activity is suitable to be licensed. In relation to objections, councils can't control the content of objections. I certainly see my job as a legal advisor to advise the committee of what is valid, competent and relevant, and certainly discriminatory grounds. Councils have public sector duties under equalities not to discriminate, and I would like to think local authorities would comply with that. We certainly do. Any objection that is made will be investigated, but bear in mind that often under council schemes of delegation, if once the representation is made, if it's not withdrawn, that removes our delegated powers as officers to grant a licence, and it has to go before a committee to be determined. So we do have restrictions under the Local Government Scotland Act of 1973 as well, that we have certain delegations that we can use and certain that we can't.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to ask about reducing the time for processing a licence to 21 days. And I was wondering if Alec Colquhoun could tell us what impact that would have for show people.
As I say, we've already negotiated. We've been there. We've negotiated now to get the lease of the land. Bingo, and it's 21 days prior to that we have to, to deal with the licence and any objections. But when we shorten that, it gives us more chance. As it stands just now, if the licence is refused, our members, they're out of business for a week or 2 weeks or whatever it is, because they can't then have any other options. But shortening this, if it looks like you're not going to get a licence, or if there's objections to the licence, you can possibly then go and try to just get another site or find yourself another fair somewhere. You know, that period of waiting for all those months, and generally, you know, I'm sure Fiona, that one of the problems is that it's generally just before the fair, before you get to the hearing. So it can only be a couple of days. You know, we've had instances where on the Friday before the fair's due to be, you know, the guys are due to pull into the fair on the Sunday, that the licence has been refused. So that's a week. You know, they've got a week where they can't find anywhere else. There's no process to go through to try and find something. So it would make things much easier on that. It would give them an opportunity to find something else.
And we've talked about the wide range of scale of fees that are charged. What is the range of processing times for Scotland's 32 local authorities?
Well, they range from 3 months down to about 21 days. 21 days is the standard. There are most licensing authorities, as Fiona says, that are generally dealt with under delegated powers. If there's no objections, it's done. If it's a fair that's gone on for quite a while, it can be done through delegated powers. So these things are relatively simple. It's new applications, it's new fairs, it's bringing in these things where the problems kind of come in. So, you know, that's kind of the way it pans out.
And Andrew Masterton, what's your experience of application times?
Look, they vary wildly. Most of my events take place in Fife. I consider Fife to be very effective in the processing of licence applications. They can turn a licence application around in 28 days. By contrast, one of the longest local authority I deal with is East Dunbartonshire Council, who have a 3-month lead time on the same entertainment licence. This Act allows showmen to have their licence application considered within 28 days. Showmen aren't looking to submit their licence application 28 days before the event. Ideally, you would sit at the start of the year, perhaps now in any regular year, and submit multiple applications at the same time. So if there is a problem with one application, we have the time after a refusal to then find an alternative site. Showmen aren't looking to put these in at the last minute. We're looking to be able to put these in early so there is a backup, which would keep us open, which would keep the wheels turning, which would keep us in business. So to answer your original question, anything in Fife from 4 weeks is probably the shortest I deal with. East Dunbartonshire Council, 3 months. Unfortunately, the weather doesn't give us 3 months notice of its intention, which makes life difficult as well.
Okay, thanks. So Fiona, Stuart, why is there such a large range of processing times within the councils from 21 days to 3 months?
It will depend on whether the authority is issuing a full public entertainment licence or a temporary public entertainment licence. Generally speaking, a temporary licence will have a quicker processing time. A full licence, because there's a site notice or newspaper advert that has to go up, will take longer. The difficulty that we have, and I would take issue that all showmen put their applications in early. My experience is because they travel from location to location, it's often quite near the time of the event that applications come in due to the nature of the business. And I'm not saying that that's a wrong thing to do. The difficulty that we have is the closer to the dates required an application comes in, if there are objections or representations and a hearing is required, we've got to give fair notice of that hearing to all parties. And getting a committee together, particularly in a summertime when committees tend to be in vacation periods, can be difficult. And the Act requires us to give 14 days notice of a hearing, and that's when we run into difficulties where a licence can be refused very close to the dates required, or in some circumstances we're not able to hold the hearing before the first date that the fairground is seeking to trade. So the majority of applications should go through in time, but the closer to the date they come in, the more problems there are for local authorities to try and guarantee that licence is granted in time. But the main difference is some will be full licences, some will be temporary.
So in terms of, tell me, what's the difference between a temporary and a full licence, and do the majority of fun fairs have temporary licences, bearing in mind that they use traditionally the same land every single year in each local authority? So what's the difference? Is it majority of fun fairs temporary licences, or is it full licence?
I can't answer that for all local authorities, I'm afraid. I haven't gathered
What's the
that
situation in
information.
Aberdeenshire?
In Aberdeenshire, we moved from full licences to temporary licences some time ago to speed up the process, because we don't require to put up a site notice for a period of 21 days. So it's reduced the processing time from 28 days down to 21 in the absence of a need for a hearing. And even that's tight, I have to say.
Right. So if you're saying that 21 days is a bit tight, the proposal in the bill, what would you say was a more reasonable timescale?
If you're building in time to hold a hearing, which would be the maximum processing time, then it would be between 8 and 12 weeks to allow the application to go out to processing, the reports to be prepared, notice to be given, and a committee to be held. And then if you're building an appeal system in on top of that, obviously if the committee decision is to refuse, then the appeal system to a sheriff court would further delay the implementation. But we do think that that's fair to objectors and applicants, because it's missing from temporary licences and is available to full licences. And so we would be looking for between 8 to 12 weeks processing time, even for a temporary licence. Obviously, if you don't need a hearing, we can grant the licence much quicker. We wouldn't need the full 12 weeks, but on average, that would be an approximate time, a reasonable time for us to process an issue.
And my last point, we've talked a lot about fees, but could you say what the impact on your own local authority would be if the fees were reduced to £50?
Well, our current costings come in at just under 150, so we would be losing £100 per application, and we don't have we don't have the capacity to absorb that cost.
No, I accept that you're coming down from 150 to 50, but what's the total income that the council gets every year from the issuing of the temporary entertainment licences to fun fairs?
I wouldn't be able to give that information to you just now. I would have to from our year. It depends on the number of fairs that come, so it varies from year to year. But I don't have up-to-date figures in front of me. I'm sorry.
Right. Okay. Thanks very much, convener.
Okay. Thank you, Gordon. I've got a couple of members want to ask a quick supplementary, and please make it quick. And can I ask you to make the responses quick as well? Andy and then Sarah.
Thanks, convener. Just a quick supplementary to Fiona in her exchange with Gordon MacDonald there. In response to a question about the timescale for granting licences and the fact that you need to go to licensing committees, you answered on the basis of the provisions of the Civic Government Scotland Act 1982 and its provisions. This bill in front of us exempts fun fairs from that act and makes them subject to this bill that's in front of us just now. So do you accept that the kind of observations you were making there are not strictly valid ones, because there's only two grounds in this bill that allow councils to refuse an application in section 9.2. So the arguments you were making there would be applicable if we kept them within the Civic Government Scotland Act, but not if this bill were to progress into law.
No, that's correct, but we still would require a hearing to refuse a licence unless there were provisions built into the legislation to allow officers to refuse. We would not have those delegated powers, so you're still talking about, we would not automatically, as officers under the 1973 Act and under our schemes of delegation, have power as officers to refuse. So you're still looking at committee time there. So you've still got fair notice, preparation time, and calling together a hearing, unless the bill was drafted in a way that provided for an alternative means.
Okay, I accept that.
No, Andy, it was just a sop. I'm going to have to bring in Sarah.
Convener, it was just a quick question about whether there's a difference between urban and rural local authorities in terms of pressure on land and capacity to keep the opportunity of fun fairs going. Just a perspective from both sides of the fence here, if that's possible. Just quickly, do you see a difference in the authorities and how they approach this? So sorry, first of all, it was Mr. Colquhoun and then Fiona Stewart.
Well, all 32 local authorities do different things, but I think in the north of Scotland, it's very much, Aberdeenshire is one of the better. I think in the north of Scotland, things are much easier. It seems to be the cities. Edinburgh certainly is the most difficult, the most expensive, so I would think there are differences there.
Thanks. And Ms. Stewart?
Again, I don't see speaking for a rural area, that there are any increased pressures because fun fairs tend to come to the same locations at the same times every year. I can't speak for a city environment because I've had no input from members on that, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Convener.
Okay. Thanks very much, sir. We've got the member who brought the bill forward, Richard Lyle. Richard, I believe you would like to ask a couple of questions. You've got a couple of questions, make them brief, and I want the responses brief as well, please.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I actually believe you've actually heard in the evidence why this bill is needed. My question to Fiona Stewart: under both local government acts, fun fairs were added to the fun fairs were not added to the English bill. My bill will resolve this. Fun fairs were actually added to the Scotland bill as an amendment, right? I want to resolve a 39-year wrong. Fiona, many councils in England charge nothing for a licence. If an applicant in Scotland is refused their licence, they lose hundreds, possibly hundreds of pounds. It's like you're into a shop asking for a TV, paying for it.
Ask a question.
Right. Why shouldn't we have this nominal fee? And I want to encourage more fairs because of this nominal fee. To Fiona. Sure.
Why shouldn't we have it? If you're going to have a streamlined process, then a lower fee would be the result of that. We're concerned about the impact on communities. With regard to fairs losing money if a licence is refused, we've still processed that application and it still costs us money to do it. So if the bill is passed with a streamlined system, then obviously costs will be less, but we will have costs and the fee should be set at a level that covers our costs. That, there will be less work, but we will still have costs.
And the licensing, most licences are for a year. A taxi window cleaner average cost is £130 to £175 in most councils. Fun fair licences are only for a few days, range from £50 to many thousands of pounds. Why is that?
Because the same amount of work has to go into producing a temp licence, with some exceptions. Obviously, we charge less for fairs because it's not as involved as a huge music event, for example, so the fee is set accordingly. But the same processing under the Civic Government Act, and that I can only talk about the Act at the moment. The bill will be, if that becomes law, will be a more streamlined process. It takes that temporary licence as it does for a full licence, so the costs.
Right. In regard to licences, I've only got another two questions, Convener, to Fiona. Sure. I understand under the 1982 Act, the original 1982 Act, temporary licences, not full licences, are exempt from objection provisions, which are in para 3, and there's no right to object. Why do you believe that the public has the right to object when even in the 1982 original Act, there's no provision? The only people that need to be contacted are the Chief Constable and the Fire Service.
The Act does not say the provisions in law do not say that the local authority must only contact the police and the fire service. The temporary licence provisions give local authorities to set a regime that is suitable for that temporary licence to be issued. And we're not mainly talking about objections here, we're talking about representations, and representations are still permitted for temporary licences. We can't ignore that in law, and in human rights law as well. Those people have to be given a voice, and case law over the years has developed that principle. So although an objection may not be competent, a representation is. And we are not bound, duty bound, only to consult with the police and the fire.
Last question, Convener. In your submission, you talk about accidents in fairgrounds. In my bill, it's not covered. Health and safety is a reserved act, and health and safety won't change. So why do you have concerns about it not being in my bill? Because I'm not changing anything in regard to health and safety.
Because we would prefer fairs to continue to be licensed under public entertainment licensing, where the grounds of refusal encompass the suitability of the premises, public nuisance, public safety, and other good reasons. So we do have the locus to take into account the safety of the rides, any accidents that have taken place. We also have a duty to protect vulnerable people within our communities that may be going on these rides. And believe me, it is not a them and a us scenario here. We welcome the fairgrounds, but we do have the right at the current time to refuse on public safety grounds. So that does not mean that safety is solely the purview of the Health and Safety Executive, and we would wish those grounds of refusal to remain for fairground licensing.
To Alec James Colquhoun.
No, I'm sorry, Richard. No, Richard, you'll get your chance next week to make your case. You've had enough questions. I thought that you only had questions to Fiona. Okay. All right. I've just got one question for Alec Colquhoun before we finish up this session. You said that most of the fairs are returning fairs and there isn't an issue with them. It was really just the new fairs that there were. Surely if there are new fairs, then it's not that you're going back to traditional haunts, and people would have the right then to, if they have concerns, to raise objections to make sure that they're heard as well.
But when I say new fairs, a lot of sites are being lost. Development is going on, as you well know. So sites are being lost all the time. Sites aren't becoming available. So we have to go out there and find new sites. What we're asking for is just that opportunity, because most times when you apply for a new license, it's being refused flat out. I've seen licenses refused on one objection. That wouldn't happen in any other, taxi drivers or anything else. Give us the opportunity to at least put that fair on for 1 year. And if there are issues, we can deal with it, we can work with it. As I say, some sites may not be suitable. But as it stands just now, under the Act and the way it's working, we aren't getting an opportunity to put fairs on to prove what we can do. We can alter opening times, we can make the closing times earlier if people feel there's issues there. We can work. This is our business. We don't want to go there and cause trouble with local authorities or with the local community. We want to go there, entertain the local community so that they will come to the fair and spend their money and have a good time. That's what we want to do. We want to continue doing that. Everyone must remember going to the fair, attending along, and yourself, you probably remember fairs in Glasgow that have disappeared over the years. We need to keep this business going. Too many local authorities want fairgrounds to come to their events, to their fireworks, to all these kind of things, but they don't want a standalone fun fair to come on its own. My members can't survive on that. We can't keep going to just one-day fairs. We need to have the standalone fairs back across Scotland, and it's being restricted.
Okay. Right, thanks very much for that. Okay, that brings us to the end of this evidence session. I appreciate the witnesses' appearance today and their answers to the questions. So thank you very much to everyone that took part, and please leave the meeting by pressing the red telephone icon. I now suspend the meeting for a panel changeover. Brief suspension of 2 minutes while broadcasting will stop recording to allow them to check the microphones of new panels. Welcome back, and I'm pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses, who are Morag Douglas, Licensing Team Leader, South Ayrshire Council, Raymond Lynch, Solicitor and Licensing Section Head, Western Bartonshire Council, and Dr Andrea Salvona from the Fair Scotland Project. Thanks for being in attendance today, and thanks for your written evidence. We've again allocated around an hour for this session. You may have heard my remarks to the last panel, that if you agree with what a panellist has already said, you should feel free to simply confirm rather than answer that question. Members again will be asked their questions in a pre-arranged order, with any supplementaries at the end if time allows. It would help broadcasting if members could indicate who in the panel their questions are addressed to in order, and if everyone could allow broadcasting a second to operate their microphones. And we'll now move on to questions. I wonder if I could ask Dr Salvona, what difference do you see this bill making to show people?
It would make a huge difference to some of the families. Show people have suffered sort of historical discrimination, and over a period of time, the effects of this bill have eroded over a period of time. Around about the same time as the legislation came in, there was difficulty starting to appear with people getting licences, and at the same time, some of the knowledge about the fairs and show people in general started to erode because there was no more sort of face-to-face interaction. So I would welcome this bill because it would enable a more kind of pragmatic approach and sensible, and it would reconnect communities with some cultural memories of the fair. I did listen to the earlier panels, and I would suggest that because it's more streamlined, it would reduce some of the arbitrary conditions that are sometimes attached, and kind of discourage some conflicting institutional demands which Alec James outlined. It would enable them to plan their businesses more effectively. And at the current condition of fairs just now, and the community itself is fragile and quite precarious. The Fair Scotland project is just at the moment looking at a project discussing how in the media about if the fair would survive because of the impact of COVID-19. And I certainly would suggest that this bill would make more pragmatic use of government resources, because I did notice in some of the submissions that the committee consults over 12 internal departments and a range of bodies. And while a range of those bodies are quite right and proper, I would suggest I would be interested in the rationale for these, because it seems like more of a response to a natural disaster than just a simple local borough fair. And I think the bill would recognise that this, the fairground is an important expression of civic culture. So I would take issue with some of the suggestions that market traders, for example, are a similar group applying for licences, because show people have a long history of discrimination, and market traders are not a group and don't experience the same kind of discrimination. And also,
sorry for interrupting, Doctor, but are you suggesting then that this bill is required because there's discrimination against show people, or is there some other reason why you think that they should get specifically looked after in a way that the market traders, for example, aren't getting?
I wouldn't say it's not for show people per se, it's for the protection of the culture, and it's the factor in some of the difficulties obtaining licensing. So I would say that that is an important factor. I mean, they are a precarious part of our cultural heritage at the moment. So that's why I would say it is a factor in the difficulties in obtaining the licenses sometimes.
Okay. Can I ask Morag Douglas, What impact, sorry, Doctor, what impact do you think this bill would have on local authorities?
I think the difficulty for local authorities would be that you are excluding any kind of public engagement with the communities solely to address the needs of the show people. And patently, you've already heard quite a lot of information this morning about fee levels. And while I can't speak for the cities because I'm from a fairly rural authority, the fees that we're charging are simply to cover costs, and the fee that's proposed wouldn't do that. And I did think it was interesting that the Showman's Guild did recognise that some of the fees, he mentioned a fee of £300 was not unreasonable in the circumstances. So I think that's quite important. But I think it's also important to realise that the public entertainment licence regime covers lots of events, not simply fairgrounds. And it does seem in some ways strange to be lifting one type of event out of the regime and giving it, if you like, a special treatment that no other type of event would benefit from.
Okay. Thanks very much. And sorry, you've gone mute on me. Can I then ask Mr. Lynch the same question, please?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I couldn't really add very much more to that. Certainly, our concerns are based on a kind of local engagement in terms of allowing elected members at a local level to make the decisions. We believe they're in the best place. I mean, if there are objections, representations, they're well versed in civic licensing matters to deal with these. And I should say that one of the weaknesses perhaps is that if a decision is refused, then there's a kind of expensive appeal procedure. So if there was some kind of change in relation to it, we'd be happy to put our decision up for scrutiny in terms of a statement of reasons and an easier appeal right in relation. We do that for other civic matters, so we don't have any qualms about that. But certainly, very few of these are refused. I'll maybe just give a practical example, if I could, Convener. There was some evidence this morning from Mr. Coon that there used to be two in Dumbarton Common. There was incidents in relation to the early 2010 or so about this, but notwithstanding that, an application was granted by a different operator by our committee in 2019. But the main problem we found was, by the temporary application nature, a lot of the members of the public, elected members, nobody knew about this, and there was concerns that something could be granted without at least the public knowing about it. So there is issues in relation to temporary applications. So we want these events to go well. That's why we buy in with so many people to ensure them. We approach them the same way as also concerts, etc. as well. And the whole key to these events is they work well in the community. In my experience is they vastly do work well, and most operators engage well. We would just like to have a kind of good lead-in period that allows that engagement and allows any issues to go in front of the committee, and we think they're better placed to do that, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, you want to come in?
Can I kick off with a question for Dr. Salvona, please? Because one of the things that's come through in the evidence and the first session we've had today is about it's a changing world, and the comment was made about where people used to have fun fairs, that there's now people living next door. Have you done any analysis on that? Because from the perspective of people living next door, even having a 3-week fun fair could be quite a massive impact on people's lives. So just wondering what you're thinking about that in terms of the evidence about how that issue can particularly be addressed. So that was, first of all, to Dr. Salvona from Fair Scotland.
We haven't done any particular analysis of that, but we are aware that there's, because of that break in the traditions, that it's quite difficult for fun fairs to get established in a new location. But what I would suggest is that sometimes part of that isn't so much based on the noise and the disruption, and that can be an element, but that's easily addressed in the new bill, that because it's an objective measure. But there is a perception when show people come when there's a new site, a new funfair site, that people have preconceived notions of who show people are. So I would suggest, I mean, I was just thinking, and just one of the things that we've found happening is that where there's a temporary application, for example, maybe in a new area, that sometimes, and I'll give you a practical example. There was a fair being established for a new area, and some objections were raised. Some of them were prejudicial, but what happened was the person running the fair took forward a petition, and most of those people supported the fair. So sometimes what does happen, and we have evidence of this, which I'm quite happy to offer in a written statement later, is that there's few voices that protest about fairs sometimes override the majority of public support as well. So I think that's something that should be taken into account. So it's very important that local communities have a voice, but it's also important that that doesn't override the majority of public support for fairs.
Okay, thanks, that's very helpful. It would be useful to see that evidence afterwards, so thank you for that offer. And can I basically ask the same questions to both the local authority witnesses? In terms of licensing, there was a comment made that one objector would be sufficient to see a licence being refused. Certainly my overview of decisions by our authority is that it would be extremely unlikely for an application to be overthrown by one objector, and in fact it's usually very difficult to get any licensing overruled if there are local objections. So have you got a perspective on the difference between fun fairs and other types of licensing, and what are the views of authorities in terms of making decisions why an application would be refused? Can you give us examples of why fun fairs would be refused that would be different from other types of licensing applications, for example? Maybe take Mr. Lynch, because you're currently on my screen first, and then I'll take the other local authority witness, Morag Douglas, afterwards.
Thanks, Deputy Convener. My experience is the same as yours, certainly in terms of objections. The idea that one objection and not being relevant to the matter, and elected members would take that wouldn't be my experience. Certainly we don't treat them any differently when they come in front of committee, and I gave the practical example of earlier where there were incidents within them, and the committee could take into account what was said by Police Scotland and any of the relevant objections, and as Fiona Stewart said, the clerk would advise on obviously what the criteria for relevant objections. The committee could decide that, and we could have a hearing. Just because you get a right to actually be heard on something doesn't necessarily translate that that'll be a reason for refusal. I think that's the simplest way to answer it, is to have the community voice or somebody saying something about it. They've then got to attend the committee. The committee have got to consider that, and have got to come to a reasoned decision in terms of the Act before it. But we have not refused any of these recently. We want to work with the operators, and we try and do as much pre-planning to allow that to happen.
Thanks. And Ms Douglas?
Yes, I would agree with what Raymond Lynch has just said, and like yourself, I think it's very, very unusual for an application to be refused on the basis of one objection. And councillors, in my experience, and have been very supportive of local fairs. From a practical example, though, I could say that we've had only one fair on a private site, not a site owned by the local authority, where there were issues which resulted in immediate complaints from both local residents and local businesses, which we attempted to deal with while the fair was happening. But the fairground operator at that time was advised that any future applications for that particular site would require to go to a committee and wouldn't be dealt with under delegated powers because of the large number of objections to the site. But we were able to find an alternative site for the fairground, and so there were no further applications the problematic site. That was trying to find a practical and pragmatic solution to a problem, but it was certainly not based on a single objection, and certainly not based on any kind of discriminatory problems. It was very much with physical problems that had occurred on the site.
And can I follow up that question with you, Morag Douglas, about the issue that we had in the first panel, where the concept of travelling fun fairs as opposed to a locally established business that's there all the time. Is there more that councils could do to actually be proactive, to work with the sector, to actually give them that opportunity? You've just talked about you found a better alternative site. Is there more that local authorities could do before you get to the process of an individual application, so that there's an ongoing dialogue between councils and the sector, so that it's a beneficial approach, so that you actually do try to identify better alternative sites if a site proposed is not going to be acceptable? Potentially things have changed, you've got new housing locally. Is that something that local authorities could do more on, regardless of this Act?
Yeah, I think there's two sides to that. The licensing authority is a regulatory authority, and it's not its job to find a site. But that's not to say that the council and other parts of the council couldn't be involved in trying to identify sites. As I say, in the particular case that I was involved with a few years ago, we were able to find another site which at least one other operator, two fairground operators have used without there being a problem. So I foresee that in the future that will be a site that will be regularly used. But I don't think it's for the regulatory side of things to deal with that. I think that would be for the councils, estates departments or whatever that could look at that. But certainly early engagement is always to be welcomed.
Thanks. I was reflecting on that when I realised who our two witnesses were, that you are licensing people, and you've obviously got that approach, but is that wider decision by the council, Mr. Lynch, in terms of talking to your colleagues? Is there that proactive approach? You own land, you let it be leased. Is there another aspect here that could actually make a win-win, where we get the right sites, income goes to the council, and we get fun fairs that are still able to operate across the country?
Yeah, I would agree with Deputy Convener. There's always scope to be more proactive and with early engagement from that side of it. But I think the problem is identifying if there could be a plan. I know it's difficult sometimes for fair people to know what specific dates, but certainly early engagement with our council departments in terms of lease, identifying sites and identifying criteria. But certainly, yeah, and I would certainly say there is scope for that that could alleviate some of the problems that then happen when you come to licensing. The more that this is troubleshooted and before it comes to licensing, we look at completely regulatory matters, then the better it is for us. And so I certainly agree with that. There is scope for that, and we would be supportive of that as a council, because we want to see events that are good for the community, safe events, and so we certainly agree with you, Deputy Convener, on that. There is scope.
Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Alexander?
Thank you, Convener. There is a view that, and it was discussed at the previous panel, that the fees set for a temporary public entertainment licence can allow some local authorities to make a profit. Can I ask Mr. Leach and Ms. Douglas what their view is on that premise?
Thanks, Convener. I'd be happy to go first if that's appropriate.
Yeah.
Certainly, from our point of view, we're operating under the 82 Act that's cost recovery. So West Dunbartonshire Council in 2014 were probably one of the first councils to do a really in-depth fee review in that. And so we did that, and it was supported, I think, by COSLA at the time as a kind of template to look at it, because there was an absence of guidance there. So we attempted in 2014 to do a kind of proper fee review. We're not to try and obviously break even, and we reviewed a lot of the kind of fees that were historically quite a low level, and that led to an increase in West Dunbartonshire's. We carried that exercise out again in 5 years' time. So from our point of view, we have potentially 3 of these per year. Our fee is £708 currently because of the nature of the temporary public entertainment, not having a bespoke fee particularly for this activity, but it's under public entertainment as it's covered. So certainly from a revenue point of view, that's probably £2,100. It's not a huge part of our fees when you consider it as to taxi and others. So it's certainly not something we're looking at a volume of fees and getting a large amount on it. But at the same time, if it did go down to a lower level, then it could create issues in how the other fees are offset as well in relation to it. So we certainly look at cost recovery and we operate within the 82 Act, but certainly it's not something we look at as, well, where can we get revenue this year, etc. And so we certainly try but there's certainly a lot of involved processes within an application, and we try and make these events as safe and go as well as they can, and that takes a lot of engagement. But certainly we put our fees up for scrutiny by field reports, and our elected members are supportive of that.
Thank you. And Maura Douglas, have you have a similar view within your own council?
Yes, I have a similar view. Our fee is currently £222 for a temporary public entertainment licence, and that really, I think, barely washes its face. I think we always make a loss on it. For the type of application that comes in for a fun fair, we ask for a plan of the ground where the rides are to be situated, etc. And we ask for the docs, that's the document of compliance to say that the machines or the rides have been inspected. And, you know, in an ideal world, I would like that application to come in with all the documents there so that we can check them once. But the reality is that for every single fun fair I have dealt with, whether it's as a standalone public entertainment licence or as part of a larger one-day event, we struggle to get all that documentation in. And we have many phone calls and emails to the person who submitted the application, chasing these up, and it literally won't be the first time that I have traipsed across the Low Green in Ayr to get the documentation for a machine on the day of an event to find that it's just being inspected that day. And that's really difficult for us, and £50 would go no way to covering those costs.
Okay, and following on from that, the bill itself makes no provision for a consultation with local communities, particularly in relation to the site of the fairgrounds that are going to be positioned. So can I ask your views on how that compares with the system we have at the moment, and what advantages and disadvantages you see if that does become the way that the process is managed?
I think as a council, South Ayrshire Council is always looking to engage with the public, and it would seem very bizarre to have a situation where you are deliberately cutting off any engagement at all. I can give an example of another event that was hopefully to have been held last year. Obviously, COVID got in the way of it. But it was during the period when a fun fair might have been able to take place, and we had an application from an operator for an event on council ground, and the council, not through licensing but through its estates department, took soundings from the community council, and they were very against the idea of leasing ground for a fun fair during the COVID times, and for that reason a lease wasn't granted, so the licensing part of things became really unimportant. In that particular case, what we have agreed with the operator is that we would roll the fee over to an application for next year for the same site. It's a site that's been used in the past and that hasn't caused an issue. That's trying to be pragmatic under the circumstances.
And Mr. Leach, do you agree with that about the lack of consultation or the no provision for that?
Yeah, I do, and I'll just quickly give one example. The issue we had was more about, we believe that in our experience that not knowing about that things causes more public apprehension than actually we've been told, and then they can actually object if they do, because a lot of the issues is it creates a concern about an event, they might be want to actually see what the event actually is. So if it is actually advertised out there, etc., and they can respond, then but certainly the community are less likely, in our opinion, once they know about the event rather than not getting told about the event, if that makes sense.
Yep. Thank you, Convener. I'm content with that.
Okay, thank you very much. Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener. Before I ask my own questions, I was wanting to ask a quick point of clarification. Morag, if I picked you up correctly, you said that your fee was £222, and Raymond, you said it was £681 for your council area, which is a magnitude of over 3 times, and we had concerns from the show people this morning about this huge discrepancy between local authorities and what they charge. So why the difference? Because presumably the majority of the cost relates to official salaries, and both of you will be using the same salary scales for your local authorities. So why is there this huge difference between the 222 in South Ayrshire and £708 in West Dunbartonshire?
Thanks, Convener. I'm happy to go first again, if that's appropriate.
Yeah.
I think you raise a valid point, and certainly in relation to fees, I've raised this at Solar previously as well, about a lack of consistency of fees across it, and certainly something when West Dunbartonshire we are regularly compared to other areas, and other members of the public ask the same question as well when they apply for licences. Why? So there is a bit of public debate about why there's such a wide variance. The way it is just now is that in terms of cost recovery, we're duty bound to look at our structures, fees, what's involved in an application, and make that best assessment and operate within the law. But if there's any guidance that comes out that would allow a clearer clarification of that, I can't comment how other local authorities do their fees, other than we did an involved exercise in 2014. We've regularly reviewed that, and that's our elected members have looked at that. But certainly, you raise a valid point as to why there is a wide discrepancy. The public sometimes don't understand that, but certainly with 32 local authorities, there might be different approaches, different costings in relation to it. But I can certainly only comment as to why West Dunbartonshire charge their fee, and we've put it in the public domain why we do.
So Morag, why is yours so cheap? And when was the last time that you actually reviewed your fees?
We haven't had a root and branch review for quite some time, and our fee has moved with inflation rather than with looking at the amount of work that's been involved. And we are due to do a full-scale review, which I think will increase fees across the board quite substantially. I'm not suggesting it would treble them, but I can see that there will be a fairly substantial increase, although that's not going to be widely acceptable to the public. But we are under a duty to cover our costs.
So could you say, Morag, how long does it take for your authority to issue a temporary licence fee? A temporary licence, I should say, sorry.
We normally are able to turn them round in 28 days, assuming that we don't have any problems with them or representations that come in. And as I think Fiona Stewart explained to you, officers in general don't have powers, delegated powers to refuse licences. That would go to a committee, and that's where the difficulty comes in that I don't think we would want officers to have that power to refuse the licences. I think it's right that elected members are involved in that decision-making process, but it's how you build that into the scheme that's difficult.
And if the proposal in the bill to reduce it to 21 days was to go ahead, what impact would that have on the council?
Well, you'd be asking us to prioritise an application from for a fund fair over everybody else's applications that we're also trying to deal with. You'll appreciate that the licensing departments in all councils deal with a huge variety of applications. So, taxi and private hire is a very good example. That's one which is very time consuming for us because of the number of applications. and also liquor applications. And we're working to timetables for those applications as well, because a lot of those applications do end up having to go to a committee. So if you're taking the funfair application in by itself and putting it against all of the other ones, you may be prejudicing other people who've lodged their applications timelessly, but we haven't been able to deal with them because we've had to prioritise something for a funfair. So it might mean, for example, that somebody who's put in an application for a taxi vehicle or a taxi driver's licence is having to wait till a further committee before they can be dealt with, which would seem very unreasonable, that I say that it should be prioritised against anything else.
Okay, thanks very much. And Raymond, same question to you. How long does it take your local authority to process a temporary public entertainment licence?
Thanks. Certainly, if it's not complex, certainly anything up till 6 weeks, probably 4 weeks period. The question is then, if the information isn't produced, there are kind of objections come in, and it requires more scrutiny. So I think we always would like to have that early planning and have a buffer that allows stuff to get in front of elected members, and that's why you might see a wide variety of processing times, because you're not working on the best case scenario where everything's straightforward, all the things are lodged, there's no issues attached to it. So certainly the earlier planning engagement, and that's partly, I think, a point that the deputy convener picked on. It's certainly something we can maybe be more proactive about across the board of what is actually required to standardisation, and try and troubleshoot problems in advance rather than when the application comes in, perhaps, as well. So certainly scope for that, to try and get some of this with the issues prior to it coming to licensing as well. So that's certainly something I'd be happy to explore off table as well, if it felt appropriate.
And one other question was, Andrew Masterton suggested that a lot of show people put in an application for a public entertainment licence for the year to various local authorities. What's your experience? Is that what you get? You get it months in advance because they're planning their year?
Unfortunately, that's not my experience, but we would like that to be the experience. If they were, the earlier planning we have in a calendar and earlier engagement to have with our estates department, etc., to set up the site. If they come back to a similar site, we roughly know when they're coming back. But the more advanced notice we get, the earlier we can identify any issues in the application form. And but certainly that's not my experience. Sometimes our experience is it's quite close to the event, and that kind of creates an issue of it in terms of timescales as well. But certainly the earlier planning it is, and if it is in early, then the onus then becomes on the local authority to properly process it. So I mean, show people should obviously take account of when the application is lodged, and the earlier it's lodged, and if local authorities aren't processing them timelessly, then that would be an issue.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Andrea Salvona, what would be the benefit to show people if it was reduced to 21 days? Can't hear you.
Muted.
Yeah.
Could we unmute Dr. Savona, please?
I'm not on mute. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's you. Yeah, it's you now.
Yeah. I would reiterate some of the points that Andrew Masterton make, that sometimes there is an issue when something goes wrong with a particular place. So it would make a real difference if it was quicker. But I mean, there's a couple of issues around the paperwork that would be a lot easier to address if it was a more standardised process as well. And I really just wanted to say that I have run my own business myself. And if I was to put in the amount of paperwork that I've seen, it would be kind of unsustainable if you're doing that week to week. It's important that the paperwork's in advance, but there can't always be situations where that happens. So it would be of benefit if it's reduced. And I have a couple of other points to say, but I'd like you to ask me in the correct sequence, if that's all right.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks very much, convener.
Okay, thank you. Andy?
Thanks very much, convener. If I could start with Dr. Savona, you mentioned in an answer, I think, to Sarah Boyack, there's been a break in tradition. Obviously, these fairs go back, in some instances, to the 12th, 13th, 14th century. There's been a break in tradition. Can you clarify, when you said the break, you relate that to the introduction of the 1982 Civic Government Scotland Act? If you could confirm that's what you mean by that. And also say a little bit about how they were regulated in towns before 1982.
Yes, so before the 1982 Act, a lot of showmen negotiated directly with the local authority. So, and it was more of a consensus-based approach. I knew in Glasgow there was a licence, but not in the same, probably a licence to occupy. So, but my own research, I just responding to your question about the break. My own research, I looked at all the interactions between the Showmen's Guild and the local authorities, and a lot of sort of social historical documentation projects at school, for example, where the families of show people recorded that their lifestyle had been quite significantly interrupted. And I did notice that that's at the period, probably from the 1990s, that there started to be significant issues with the Local Government Act having all these different conditions attached to different local authorities. But when I'm speaking of the break, what I'm really referring to is that as fairgrounds decline in numbers, there's a loss of kind of daily interaction between the local communities and show people. So that when that break occurs, the collective memory of communities, the fairgrounds is an intergenerational activity, and those memories are passed from family to family. So when the shows decline, when there's sort of fairgrounds taken away, that kind of collective memory disappears. So that therefore it becomes quite hard to establish yourself back in a new community. But it does take a wee bit of work between the local authorities and showmen to get that established again.
Okay, thanks very much. And the next question, if I could start with Morag Douglas and then Raymond Lynch. Do you, as local authority officers, recognise the problems and the issues that have been raised by show people in relationship to the current licensing regime? Do you recognise those issues and consider them to be valid issues in relationship to the tradition they are carrying on? Morag Douglas.
I do recognise the concerns that they've raised about fees. I think that's understandable, and I think that is something that needs to be addressed. I do accept that there isn't an appeal process, for example, that is particularly good with the temporary licences, so I accept that too. But I don't recognise the problems with trying to arrange fairs taking place. I've been doing this job for 15 years, and apart from one site which caused multiple problems, we've always been able to issue the licences for fun fairs. Sometimes after a bit of negotiation. I'm not suggesting everything's always been straightforward, but I can't think of another situation where events have been refused, and certainly I don't recognise any talk of discrimination either from, in my experience, I can only say, representations which would be discriminatory. I don't have any personal experience of that. I think there is always a bit of NIMBYism from the public with any kind of application. So, but I think councillors and in any committee can deal with that quite effectively.
Okay, Mr. Lynch.
Probably just reiterate a lot of what Morag has said in relation to it. Certainly where there is inconsistency, it's easy to point within 32 authorities to inconsistency, though notwithstanding inconsistency that may happen, certainly our view is that local elected members and who know the local area can deal with these matters if there's proper time to deal with them in front of committees if that's appropriate. A lot of them don't require to go to committee. A lot have dealt with, and in our view is that we are trying to facilitate as best as we can these events, and they're not straightforward, and at times this 82 Act, I think if we go back to the heart of it, is public safety, and certainly that's why a licensing system is in place in relation to it, because we require, there's public safety concerns, we want these events to go well and minimise any risk in relation to it, but certainly we're keen to have such events within our area. We just like the idea of kind of having proper planning, proper preparation for them, and proper local involvement.
Okay, thank you. And if I can stay with you, Mr. Lynch, I mean, on that point, Mr. Colquhoun referenced the regulatory regime in England, and I think was actually looking through a licence to occupy a site in Carlisle, where the concerns you've just raised about, for example, public safety, are built into that one document, which is an agreement between the local authority and the fair operator to occupy a site and to take all the relevant appropriate steps in terms of safety and having certificates and all the rest of it. Do you recognise that there would be merit, and this is not what the bill is proposing, obviously, in having such a system so that the council can satisfy itself that all the issues that it has legitimate concerns about making sure are okay are addressed, and you have basically a one-stop shop for fair operators, because your councils are issuing licences, but then they're also, as part of an entirely separate arrangement, arranging leases for sites.
Yeah, I think my view would be there are two different things. When you look at a lease, that covers kind of things to do with grounds, and it wouldn't cover kind of licensing specific. I can give an example. When we used to have concerts at Ballock Park, you would have a kind of the ground lease in relation to that would cover matters in terms of reinstatement of ground, etc. Then you would have your public entertainment licence sitting separately that would cover a wide variety of safety matters, and so I think it would be difficult within a lease that's looking at the property kind of nature of it to cover that specifically, and we would still advocate that a licence separately allows everything to point to that licence, look to the conditions, it's a clear document. So it certainly might be something my property colleagues can answer better in relation to that, but certainly our experience is I can see the advantage to look at when one document covers all, but historically the licensing regime has been separate, and the licence to occupy is English in England is different, and obviously we would have the ground lease, etc. But that's certainly something that maybe property lawyers can answer better than myself in relation to that. But certainly that's how we've kind of done it in the past. But again, something that could be looked at if there is scope to incorporate a better kind of one-stop shop, as you put it. But certainly we do believe licensing specific concerns would be better dealt with a licensing document.
Okay, we'll maybe speak to Carlisle City Council about how it operates. Morag Douglas, do you have anything additional to observe on that question?
Yeah, I would just like to say that when there are events which are held on private ground, that would mean that there would be no scrutiny of those events at all, because the council would have no input into that. So I think that is something that should be borne in mind.
Thank you very much, Convener.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Keith.
Thanks, Convener. Just to two of the panellists, if I can ask just a really one question, but obviously the committee is wrestling with a number of different things. You know, is the current regime necessary? Is it superfluous? Is it duplicating other things? Also, how can we reduce the costs or reduce the process? And I think the idea of more fun fairs is something we'd all like to see. It's more generates more economic activity. We could all do a bit of fun when we're able to go to them. But I suppose the big issue is who pays. If local authorities are not able to recover the costs involved, who pays? Is one way around this, and I accept the point that's just been made that there's two different things going on here to do with the land and the other things. There's one way around this not to have a licence in a different form whereby any operator coming to you that's got a licence, it's got stamps on it for the mechanical checks, for health and safety, for everything, they're a known operator, you know them, and all the rest of it. That is enough to mean there shouldn't be a process. You know that unless there's an endorsement on that licence for having transgressed in some way or something, that would be enough, and that would deal with quite a number of the applications that you get. It would simplify it, would reduce the work that you have to do, and reduce the cost to the operator. Sorry, can I ask both Dr. Dr. Savlona and also Douglas.
So,
Dr. Savlona first.
Yes, so I think the Showman's Guild would appreciate any improvement on the bill proposed or with the actual Local Government Act. But what I will say is there could be more imaginative kind of technological processes put in place where, for example, you might have a portal with all that documentation is left on the portal and local authorities can access this. But I've noticed, I mean, just this huge, large variation of processes. I know that, you know, one local authority checks all these bodies and consults with them all, and another one asks Showman to go around and consult with these bodies themselves and then submit their application. So, and the other thing is, just picking up that I don't think the local authorities, I don't think there's a full overview of local authorities. So whereas some of the attendees at this meeting are saying that it's not in their experience that they have these events, I found it very difficult in my research to have that full overview. And a lot of these situations are more prevalent in some areas than others. So anything that would streamline the process to give you an overview of what's happened would be quite beneficial, I think.
And Morag Douglas.
Thank you. I think it's worth just taking a moment to explain that when an application comes in, it's made by an individual, but that individual doesn't own or operate all the rides and attractions that are within that fairground. So the certificates for the individual rides are all issued to the operators of those individual rides. So when a fair comes, although it might be the same operator from two different venues, it's not necessarily the same attractions that come with each fair. Now, to use an example, when a circus comes to us, the circus operator obviously is moving from place to place, and they give us an electronic file with absolutely all their information on it. So it's the structural information about the tent, it's about the health and safety risk assessments, everything is in the one place. My personal experience when I receive an application is that everything comes in piecemeal, and I have already alluded to that. But I think the operators could help themselves greatly if they got themselves better organised and submitted all their documentation together and submitted documentation that was in date, because quite often we find that the documentation that's submitted is out of date. And what that means is another phone call, another email, trying to chase that up, trying to have one coherent application. And sadly, my experience is very much that that's not what happens. And as I say, I think that's a great difficulty with what we receive.
Can I just come back at my last questions? Just come back on that. If then, and I accept your point, if the authorities having to run around and do things because the applicant hasn't done that, then there's a cost attached to that. I understand that. But surely it must be possible, given the comment Dr. Savlona made, which is a very good one. If you think about the way local authorities have changed the way they've dealt with property inquiries for house purchases over the years, it must be possible to have databases from each of the organisations, health and safety, mechanical one, all the rest of it, you know, at the operator's instigation, where they've got approval on those things, and you can more or less, a click of a button, check them. And if they haven't done that, then it is down to them to go and check it, and there should be a cost attached to that. But surely it is possible to have a streamlined service, an IT-based one.
Well, I do agree with you to an extent. I think the difficulty is that the number of people who are involved in an individual fair, when we get an application, we don't know who those individuals are. So, you know, there'll be somebody operating the Waltz, or somebody operating the Dodgems, somebody operating the Miami thing. And if we don't have information about who those are or what their references are with any database that we could check, then again that's a very time-consuming process. But I do agree there's room for improvement. There's absolutely no question of that. There is room for improvement on both sides.
Okay, Keith.
Yes, thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Can I just put on the record that I know what the Waltzers and the Dodgems are, but I've never heard of the Miami. Must be a while since I've been. Okay, Richard, you got a couple of questions, please. Keep them short.
Yeah, if you don't mind, a couple of questions to Raymond Lynch and a couple of questions to Morag Douglas, but I will be distinct. Raymond, I noticed your council's licence fee is £708. Do you think it's fair that an applicant loses £708 if the licence is refused instead of the proposed £50?
I wouldn't like anybody losing any money in terms of a fee. You can understand that the costs are based on that, and that's why if there's early planning these events, proper consistency, then we would be, as Morag says, we're quite happy that if there is any improvements within the system that can help to assist that. And certainly our experience as a council is we're quite happy to have these events. But you're right, I wouldn't like to see anybody losing such a fee. It's a large amount of money, and understand, and I fully respect that.
Do you know how many funfair applications you get in an average year?
3. We have 3. Normally 3.
3 a year?
Yeah, 3, yes.
3 a year. Okay, thanks for that. Morag, do you agree that health and safety is not devolved and will not be changed by this bill? Operators will still need to show their relevant safety checks and test certificates to the councils that they make applications to, even if it's multiple families doing the one fair. They still, health and safety checks still have to be done, and health and safety is not covered by this bill because it's devolved and won't be changed.
I'm not quite sure that I completely understand your question, in as much as the applications that come into us right now, we do check all those certificates as part of our application process, and have uncovered problems in the past with those, as I've mentioned, with certificates being out of date, that kind of thing. In my experience, the health and safety executive tend to become involved after the event. If there has been an incident at a fairground where somebody has been injured, that's when health and safety tend to come on board to do the investigation side of things, rather than the upfront looking at the event in advance.
Right, can I also ask you, how many funfair applications on average do you get a year? And do you think it's fair that a person who's refused their application in South Ayrshire would lose £222 rather than £50?
Well, I think for all civic government licences, the position is the same, that the application fee is not refundable. So if, for example, somebody applies for a taxi driver's licence and his application is refused, that he has lost the fee, and that's made clear up front. And that would be because there had been some form of objection. These licences are not refused flippantly or without a great deal of consideration. And if the council has done all the work that it's required to do prior to that decision having been made, then yes, I do think it's difficult. I appreciate it's difficult for people, but I do think that it's correct that the fees should be covered, because how else is the council meant to cover the cost of the work that it's done? £50 just simply doesn't look at it.
You don't know how many funfairs you have?
Oh, sorry. Standalone funfairs, probably 8 to 10 a year. The rest are normally included as part of bigger events. So something like the Air Show, the Agricultural Show, they come in as part of that event, and the fee is paid by the organiser of the full event rather than by the individual operator. So, for example, when the Air Show, which is the biggest event that is held in South Ayrshire, which maybe attracts something like 80,000 people over 2 days, the cost there is no cost to the fairground operator because that's covered by the bigger public entertainment licence, which covers the whole event. That's not to say that we are not still looking for the same documentation from the fairground operator for all the rides that come along with that.
So really your council will only lose under £2,000 a year if this bill went through, based on the number of fares you have, based on your fee and my fee.
Yes, it's going to be providing a service at a cost to other people who are applying for licences. So we've got costs that are involved, and if you put them all into a basket and say, well, it's okay, those people don't need to pay, so those people will need to pay more, I think you'll be prejudicing other applicants who would then be covering the cost.
I disagree with that, but I'll leave it at that. Convener, for time.
Thank you very much, Richard. You'll have plenty of time to talk next week. Okay, thank you very much. That concludes our questions and concludes this evidence session. I thank all who took part in the meeting for helping identify some key issues in relation to our future report to Parliament on this bill. Our next evidence session is on the 3rd of February with Richard Lyle, who is the member in charge of the bill. If members of the panel and Richard can leave the meeting by pressing the red telephone icon, and I remind committee members that we remain in public for the next item. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Okay. Agenda item 3 is a consideration of negative instruments 435 and 437 as listed on the agenda. I refer members to paper number 3, which contains further detail. The instruments are laid under the negative procedure, which means that the provisions will come into force unless the Parliament agrees to a motion to annul them. No motions to annul have been laid. Instrument 435, Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered the instrument on the 12th of January 2021 and determined that it did not need to draw the attention of the Parliament to the instrument on any grounds within its remit. Instrument 437, the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered this instrument on 12th of January 2021 and determined that it did not need to draw the attention of the Parliament to the instrument on any grounds within its remit. Does anyone have any comments on either instrument? If so, please make clear which one you are referring to. Sarah, then Andy.
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to make a couple of brief comments about the permitted development rights order that we have in front of us. Sorry, Convener, I didn't hear that.
Which instrument?
Yes, I was just going to say the permitted development order, which is number 437.
Right, okay.
So it's one about general permitted development and use classes order in relation to the Town and Country Planning Amendment Order 2020. I suppose that it was just, I'm not against the instrument, but I did have questions about how it's going to be monitored in terms of its implementation to make sure that if there are problems with it, that those issues are addressed. There's obviously some concerns people have got about the changes, concerns and uneasiness, I think, in terms of the size of masts, in terms of the potential detrimental impact on the visual impact of areas. So I'd be very keen that that is monitored. I also note that there's some concerns about potentially the agricultural buildings, why I can understand why that's being suggested, that potentially that has a cumulative impact if we see lots of housing being built and developed out in rural areas and not reinforcing developments in our towns and villages. I'm thinking of the town centre first policy, where there might be opportunities in town centres. And also, I have had some concerns about bike sheds, which is something I very much support, but I'm wondering about the issue about guidance where it's maybe in sensitive areas, such as conservation areas, where there's something about the style and quality of bike sheds. So we do get them there, but they don't impact on the quality of an area. But I'm not against this change because You know, we've got big cars and lorries can park outside people's houses in those areas, so it's just getting it proportionate and maybe councils being able to give good advice. So, not, as I say, not against that, but I would be interested in whether there's going to be monitoring by the Scottish Government and feedback from local authorities over time. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, it's on the record now anyway, Sarah. So, Andy, you wanted to come in?
Yes, thanks very much indeed, Convener. I mean, the first point I want to put in the record is I continue to believe that it's inappropriate for pretty significant changes to the planning regime to be brought in by a negative instrument like this. We are faced with affirmative instruments where we have nothing to say because there really isn't anything to say, and yet the Minister has to appear before the committee to move it, to take evidence and to debate it. And yet today we have no Minister before us, and I contemplated lodging a motion to annul. I decided not to because everyone is too busy at this time and it would have achieved little. But for example, I'd just like to agree with Sarah Boyack. I mean, I do have concerns about the agricultural development. The more than doubling the size of a agricultural building is, I think, something that should be debated properly, because although that may reflect new agricultural practices, it doesn't change the potential impact that a building of 1,000 square metres might have in the landscape that in any other industry would be regulated by full planning controls. It's also, I note, that private ways, hill tracks, etc., which were meant to be reviewed and in terms of the permitted development regime, have been relegated to phase 3 of the government's work, and it's regrettable that's not coming forward. But this instrument does contain a lot of important measures. I just think it's very regrettable that these measures are introduced into Parliament in such a way that there's really no scope for any meaningful debate or any meaningful ways in which, for example, one could object to the doubling in size of agricultural buildings, but at the same time agree with the rest of the order. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Obviously, you know that it's out of our control if it's negative or affirmative, but at least you've now got your comments on the record and the government will be made aware of them. Okay, anybody else have any comments? In that case, I invite the committee to agree that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to these instruments. Does anyone object? No, therefore that is agreed. That concludes the public part of this meeting, and we will resume the meeting in private in Microsoft Teams. Please accept the clerk's meeting request for the private discussion, which will be sent shortly. I suggest we have a 5-minute break and you can exit the meeting in the usual way. Thank you.